It's great to be at Yale because there's a person who's been very influential in my work and the work of many of you, whether you know it or not. He's a professor here at Yale, Dr. John Wargo. And years ago, John showed up at a conference at Beyond Pesticides. We didn't know enough at the time to invite him, so he decided, oh, I'm gonna come down to the conference. At that time, we were doing our conferences in Washington, D.C., mostly. And he brought with him a tremendous amount of knowledge, and everyone recognized that, and has since come back as speaker numerous times. John's the author of our Children's Toxic Legacy, which is a seminal work in terms of identifying the connection between pesticides and children, the adverse impacts associated with children's exposure, elevated risk factors, and he'll explain, I'm sure, a lot of that today. And a newer book called Green Intelligence, which has won the Independent Publishers Gold Medal Award. This is an accomplished guy who is very low-key about his accomplishments, so please help me warmly welcome John to his own building and this conference.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. And thank you for coming to Yale. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here. This is my home turf. I've been here for more than 2 decades, taught more than 3,000 students, and I'm I'll put it closer to my mouth. I've been here for a long time. Can you hear me now? Louder. Okay. There you go. All right, how's that? Good. If anybody cannot hear me, then just put a finger up in the air and I'll shift. I tend not to stay at the podium, which is the reason I don't use that mic. And I also have a soft voice. All right, I'll speak more loudly. Is that all right? Great. Well, thank you, and welcome. And my job today is to give you a sense of the essential lessons of pesticides. Before I do that, I just want to take a moment to thank.
John, I'm sorry, if you could move that down to your sorry.
How's that? I wanted to take a moment to thank Jay Feldman for all he's done. Jay and I go back at least a couple of decades in terms of our relationship. And we have exchanged knowledge, we've exchanged students, and we also have worked side by side trying to encourage the government to adopt a variety of standards that would be more protective of the health of the most vulnerable. I also wanted to acknowledge and thank Rout Reichert, president of Beyond Pesticides. Rout and I go back a long way as well, perhaps not just as long as my relationship with Jay, but we've fought intellectually with industry representatives and government representatives at EPA on scientific advisory boards and panels for a number of years. Again, trying to encourage more responsible behavior toward chemicals that we believed posed threats, especially to the youngest in society. Jerry Silbert, Nancy Alderman, Doug and Patty Wood, I know are here, and I also just want to thank them and all of you that have done so much with the groups that you represent in trying to make a significant difference. So what are these essential lessons? They're a bit complicated, and I wanted to run through a number of them with you this morning while trying not to spend too much time on any one. I've broken them into 2 categories. One, a set of categories on the left-hand side, which I call scientific lessons, and another that I call management lessons that deal with the effectiveness of law. And in my work, I'm an odd academic at Yale in that I'm a hybrid of sorts. I work very much on the technical and scientific questions of how we're exposed to dangerous substances as a way of thinking about strategies for exposure reduction. So if I leave you with one message today, it would be to encourage you to learn how to reduce exposure. I also work on the law and regulations, and also non-regulatory approaches, especially certification efforts, to try to reduce exposures. These are essential methods to try to join together. So briefly today, I'm going to run through a variety of examples of the key lessons that we've learned, but it's almost as if we suffer from attention deficit disorder or memory deficit, so that we tend to keep forgetting these central lessons that involve persistence, chemical mobility, understanding the routes of exposure via air or water or food or say dermal exposure, body burdens, problems with toxicity testing, recognizing that there are susceptible groups in the population that might be defined by age, they might be defined by ethnicity, they might be defined by background characteristics, illnesses, for example, that make them more susceptible. The fact that we're exposed to mixtures of chemicals at all times. And Beyond Pesticides is focused on pesticides and inert ingredients and the development of the National Organic Standard and its implementation. But this is occurring, our exposures are occurring inside this a much larger universe of chemicals that include the pharmaceuticals, that include the genetically modified substances, that include food packaging compounds that can migrate from the packaging to food. They also include solvents that are used to extract oils. They include many other substances, so that we're exposed to an ever-changing complex mixture of compounds that has produced a global scale experiment on our generation in how we respond, how our health responds to these ever-changing exposures, and also the incapacity of scientific experts to conduct controlled experiments. If everybody's exposed to constantly changing mixtures, where's your control group? So that's a key lesson to keep in mind. With respect to management, some of the key lessons have to do with the potential and ineffectiveness of labeling. So what is the potential of labeling? We rely so heavily on it. The reliance also of pesticide law on the concept of training and licensing applicators, so that you can train people to spew chemicals that are recognized to be toxic substances to the environment in a way that doesn't control or doesn't impart significant risk, so that over enthusiasm for that regulatory approach has led to many problems and many serious exposures. Surveillance. Any environmental law has an Achilles heel that is surveillance. If you don't do the monitoring, if you don't do the enforcement, then why bother having the law and the regulation in the first place? I use the analogy with my students. It's like my town in Killingworth. I live in a little one stoplight town with no policemen, but we have stop signs and we have speed limits, and it's kind of a joke. You've got the laws in place, but you've got nobody there that's monitoring and nobody that's enforcing. So you can take that concept and think about the number of samples that are tested each year by the Environmental Protection Agency of water supplies or of individual foods for individual chemicals, and realize that the sampling design is grossly incapable of detecting shifting patterns of residues in air, in water, in food. And if we don't have a system set up that is really strategically oriented toward where the chemicals are being used, those chemicals that are the most toxic substances, especially in areas where perhaps children are, such as schools, then we don't really have any capacity to intervene and reduce exposures. Again, that is really the end point here that I think we all should be keeping an eye on. The burden of proof. Where should the burden of proof lie? Well, the history in the 20th century on pesticides is that the burden of proof is laid with the public to demonstrate these chemicals are dangerous as a logic to regulate them, as a logic to get them perhaps out of the food supply or to ban them completely. So that's a huge burden that is falling out on a poorly funded, broad public. Now the Food Quality Protection Act, as I'll talk about in a few moments, was really quite significant in that it shifted that burden of proof to the manufacturers to demonstrate that the products could be used safely, that there was reasonable certainty of no harm. That is the legal standard, reasonable certainty of no harm. So that, you know, as you're thinking about what a fundamental logic might be to induce a shift in practice, think about the overwhelming importance of the shift of the burden of proof to the manufacturers to do prior testing, to do of toxicity, of mobility, of persistence, of what happens to the chemical once it gets into the human body. Also be aware that bans are very rare in human history. We have 1,000 active pesticide ingredients that are registered in the United States, 22,000 active registrations, separate products that you can find in the marketplace with each having a different label. And we rarely ban an entire chemical. There are fewer than 100 chemicals, active ingredients, that have been banned during the 20th century and during the last decade. So that instead of banning, we tend to regulate where it can be used, the concentration that's allowable under certain conditions, worker re-entry intervals, allowing it to be used on apples but not on kumquats, you know, or on soybeans, so that the complete ban of a product is extremely rare, and it normally just means that the international corporate network that is producing it and marketing it moves that product to another country where the regulations are not as stringent. Also, certification programs. Certification programs have been essential. I think of government regulation as a form of certification, because when you see a pesticide label that says approved by EPA, that's a form of certification. It's giving the consumer confidence that this must not be a toxic substance. I mean, after all, it's in my hardware store, or it's even in Walmart, and it may be even on the aisle next to the food aisle. So that there's this presumption that certification, whether it's regulation or by a third-party group, that conveys an image of it being safe, environmentally responsible, and it really does, with some exceptions that I'll come back to, including the National Organic Standard and the European Union standards. Another critical issue is what I think of as narrative advantage. In telling stories about risk, who's got the narrative advantage? Well, clearly, beyond pesticides, Natural Resource Defense Council and other groups do not. I just got back from Europe. I was at one of the world's largest pharmaceutical and pesticide manufacturing companies and met with their global products division. They make hundreds of different pesticides, and they make probably 100 different pharmaceuticals, and they are also deeply into genetic modification of crops, and they're selling these as packages. They have hundreds of PhDs that are expert in all areas of toxicology, environmental fate, so that you compare that to the expertise that exists inside the environmental community, and you see that in court or in public hearings, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the technical detail that can be provided by those scientific experts. You can simply compare the pay scale of scientific experts at EPA compared to those that work at Monsanto or DuPont or Syngenta, and find that they will go in and try to buy the absolute best kind of talent and rotate them out if they're not working really well. They don't have a civil service system in place. So narrative advantage, the ability to tell a story about risk is very disproportionate. And don't forget that 95% of science that occurs in the world is not occurring as a result of government funding through the National Science Foundation. It's occurring because of private investment, research and development investment on the part of corporations, so that they can understand what their potential liability may be. And that research may or may not, and normally does not see the light of day, does not become public interest. It's private intellectual property owned by that corporation that may or may not be requested by an environmental protection agency as a basis for registration or licensing. We're fighting preemption here in Connecticut because we believe that allowing lower levels of government to have the the ability to set standards is very, very important. And we learned that lesson with the Clean Air Act in California. When Congress passed the Clean Air Act, they exempted California because of their special circumstances, their intense pollution, because of the coastal range and the Sierras basically blocking the air. The LA basin in particular is long been problematic. So they were exempted. They could adopt their own standards, and they did, and they were more rigorous than the federal government, and manufacturers had to comply with those regulations. And that technological innovation made its way across the country, was adopted by all manufacturers, and eventually across the world. So the power of preemption on the part of, in the thinking of manufacturers, designed to level the regulatory playing field, the power of preemption is enormous. So under the statutes to control pharmaceuticals, tobacco, pesticides, you find that states have their hands tied. That states are not allowed to innovate and become more health protective or environmentally protective than the federal government. And that allows the company to avoid the situation where they need to adopt different products and different labels and meet different requirements in 50 different environments. And we all know how expensive that would be. But the degree of innovation that you can get by doing away with preemption is enormous. And protection of the most susceptible. There are several statutes, including the Clean Air Act, that demands protection of all with an ample margin of safety, but also the standard inside the Food Quality Protection Act. It's a gold standard in terms of law. Reasonable certainty of no harm, and the administrator of EPA must make a finding that children would be protected by the issuance of a license or a pesticide registration. So these are basic examples, and if you want to find out more about this, you can read my book. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, it's particularly a good strategy. Green Intelligence, where I took the idea that that there are these susceptible populations and they are overexposed, and that law may or may not be effective for a whole array of reasons. And I compared 5 different scenarios. I compared pesticides, but not the food use pesticides, because I've become fascinated by indoor uses of pesticides where I think the exposures are often greater. I compared that scenario to the nuclear weapons testing era in the 1950s, to diesel emissions, particularly low diameter particulates, carbon particles that are emitted from diesel vehicles, to the problem that we face with mercury in the food chain, to plasticizers, the compounds in plastics that we know are building in all of our bodies as a result of an unregulated chemical industry and unregulated plastics industry. So I compared whether or not there were similarities and differences across these 5 cases. And I was actually dumbfounded after I'd done the research that they all had stories about the susceptibility of the youngest, of higher levels of exposure depending upon specific behavioral patterns that might be defined by food intake or water intake or where people spent their time, so that people that run, for example, in New Haven during rush hour along the highway are going to be far more exposed to particulates than people that would run at noon if they ran up the backside of East Rock Park. So we know this. We've done studies that have demonstrated that. So that's an example of how differences in behavior can lead to differences in exposure that could lead to a regulatory strategy or just your own common sense. I mean, my students don't think about this when they go out and they just take a run around New Haven, but it could be important to your body burden. Just the way that the specific dietary pattern that you commonly take on can be important to your exposure to foods. So I wanted to spend a few moments on the idea, the fundamental idea of chemical persistence and mobility, because we think most of us think we understand this pretty well, but I think we don't. And I want to take you back to World War II and DDT and the period of time when we were invading the Solomon Islands. We were moving into the North African theater. My dad was crawling his way across Europe as an infantryman, and although in Europe malaria was not a problem, it was a serious problem in Africa and a very serious problem in the Pacific. And the incidence rate of malaria was 3,000 per person, 3,000 per thousand, meaning that on average during any one year the average GI would get malaria 3 times. So it was a debilitating illness, and the government did not have the capacity to manage it well until DDT was discovered or the insecticidal properties were discovered by Paul Mueller back in 1939. I was next to his office last week, by the way. It was really kind of interesting in downtown Basel, talking to people that were very proud of Paul Mueller's role. And Paul Mueller was a medical doctor, and he was eventually given the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the insecticidal properties because of its effectiveness in bringing these epidemics of yellow fever, malaria, dengue fever to a close. And they did this by fumigating. Here's a bicycle pump going down the back of a child who is immigrating through Europe during World War II. So, you know, the drill was you get the bicycle pump pumped down the back of your shirt, down the front of your pants, and up both of the pant legs. And when the U.S. government allowed this and promoted it, it brought a typhus epidemic in Naples to a close with very few deaths and few illnesses. So that the effectiveness gave it the image of sanitation. So that this image of pesticides and sanitation had a very important effect in law, and also the acceptability of pesticides, particularly in the post-war period when these compounds were released for a whole array of different uses, especially in the food supply. So the jingles that encourage people to you know, be perfectly content with DDT residues in their foods you know, demonstrate this. Here's another sign on the side of a truck that many of you may have seen, and I've used it in the book, DDT, and if you could read it, it says powerful insecticide harmless to humans. So that another example, people played in it. Kids would run after the trucks down the streets. Eventually it was banned when EPA came into being in 1970, 1960, late 1969 actually. And also, if you could read this this clip from the New York Times, you would see that Mr. Ruckelshaus, Bill Ruckelshaus, who was then the administrator of EPA, recommended that DDT be replaced by a substitute pesticide, methylparathion. So, you know, there's a lesson here. And the lesson here is that we have had a tendency in the 20th century to move from the chlorinated hydrocarbons, which, by the way, were preceded by a nasty set of chemicals, which included predominantly the heavy metals, so lead and arsenic and mercuric compounds that existed and were in heavy use before DDT. They're still detectable in farmland that was used at that point in time. So that the metals were replaced by the chlorinated hydrocarbons, DDT, aldrin, dieldrin, chloridane, heptachlor. They were eventually phased out by EPA in the 70s and 80s and replaced by organophosphates and synthetic pyrethroids. So that you know, the image that I carry in my mind is one of these waves of chemical technology sweeping around the world, recognizing that, oh, these are not as safe as we thought they were. Now what are we going to do? And gradually pulling them out of the marketplace. The next wave gets adopted in widespread use. And we realize that maybe we didn't think carefully enough about persistence or movement or what it does when it gets in the body, or how it might especially affect specific wildlife. So that this is a simple model that you know, I use in my teaching, that you have to pay attention to where chemicals are released. You need to think about where they end up, contaminated media, food, water, air, surfaces. We need to think about how they can get into our bodies. You know, what's the route of exposure is the technical term of art. Via ingestion, via dermal exposure, via inhalation, or via all three if you happen to be in an occupational setting. What is the route, what's the distribution in the body, and what's the tissue fate? And these are all questions that even precede the question of toxicity. So, you know, we haven't even asked the question about is it neurotoxic, is it carcinogenic, is it a reproductive toxin, does it stimulate the immune system? So these are all important questions. Now I wanted to share with you some thinking that represents my latest research. And you can't see this very well, I'm sure, because of the light that we've got up there. But down here we've got day number 1 through day number 35. And here we have exposure expressed normally. Exposures are normally expressed like you know, medicines are per unit of your body weight. You know, we've got grams, like a half of a gram tablet of Tylenol would be an example. But chemicals like this, the exposures are often expressed in micrograms per kilogram body weight per day. So if this chemical had a half-life of 3 days, whereas DDT had a half-life of over 6 months, so that it was far more persistent. And strontium-90 that I wrote about in my book has a half-life of almost 30 years. So that that half-life issue really is something to pay a lot of attention to and to kind of burn it into your mind if you're comparing across different possible threats and you're trying to think in your head what's really worth worrying about. So that in this example, you see that you have an exposure on day 1, and if you have no more exposures, then you would still carry the chemical in your body for a period of at least 30 days. And I ran out of room on this chart to put in enough additional information that's represented here. What happens if you're exposed on a routine basis? Supposing you're going back into a workplace every day that has the same kind of chemical exposure. And so that the orange represents day 1, the yellow represents day 2, the purple day 3. So what you see is that if you're going back into the same environment, that you build up the exposure over time. Then if you stop, then it would gradually decline. So this kind of thinking about persistence of exposure, thinking about body burden and how the chemical behaves in the body has not been prominent in EPA's thought. And here's an example of an apartment being sprayed periodically every 6 weeks. So, and this is the pattern that you would see, depending upon what your assumption was about decay rates. So that if you assume a 1% decline per day, you would have a decline at this rate. It's very slow, 5% per day. So that it's very easy to see how this periodic spraying could produce a gradually increasing exposure across time, unless you thought like this. So that we've misunderstood persistence in many different ways. And when you misunderstand persistence, you always misunderstand mobility, where the chemical goes. I use this shot just to remind myself that like strontium-90, DDT and the chlorinated compounds, low diameter particulate matter, even some of the plasticizers are measurable in the atmosphere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They've gone into global circulation. And they fall out at different rates into the environment. And like strontium-90, DDT would fall out onto landscapes far from where they were applied and thereby contaminate foods that were grown in those landscapes, even though the farmer had not applied it. So I'm going to jump way ahead here to reach a couple of conclusions because I'm going to run out of time. I wanted to make one more point and also to highlight some research that I'm doing now. This chart turned out to be very formative in the passage of the Food Quality Protection Act. And I generated this for the National Academy of Sciences Committee back in 1993 that produced the report, Pesticides in the Diets of Infants and Children, that I think fairly can be argued was the intellectual argument why that statute needed to be placed and why kids were at special risk. And think about the life cycle from birth to full maturity. Most people think that full maturity in humans now is roughly the age of 22 or 23. And think about the maturity of organ growth rates. And some organs grow beyond a normal rate and then they decline because of a variety of different factors that I don't have time to go into. But the point here is that the thymus, the brain, the stature, ovaries, uterus, and testes, these grow most rapidly at different points in time during youth, from time of conception to time of full maturity. And the scientists at the National Academy that were looking at this realized that it's these steep rises that are periods of time to really worry about. So that rapid rates of growth and development are periods of time when you do not want the youngest in society to be exposed to this complex mixture of chemicals that we're talking about now. So I'm going to take you to one more diagram here because this is not part of the thinking on EPA at this point in time, and my viewpoint is that it ought to be. And that is that we're not considering fetal exposures the way that we should. We all know that the Centers for Disease Control has initiated body burden testing since the late 1990s. And body burden testing is demonstrating human exposure, but they're not generally testing amniotic fluid. And you find a number of different laboratories that are testing amniotic fluid. And the people that are doing a terrific job on this include Ricky Pereira at Columbia in New York at Mailman, and also Robin Wyatt. But think about the importance of the body weight question. So, you know, your child may be exposed just to the same degree in terms of the dose that you might experience as an adult. But because exposure is reduced to by the body weight conversion, their exposure per unit of body weight is far higher than adults would be, given the same basic environmental exposures. Now, if you carry that argument, if that chemical makes its way into to a pregnant woman's body, and it also makes its way across the placenta and into amniotic fluid, that the fetus is in dermal contact with constantly. It is literally inhaling the fluid. It's ingesting the fluid. So there are 3 routes of exposure, and you've got minuscule body weight by comparison. So that the arguments about why pesticide exposure levels were not safe back in the 1990s that preceded the Food Quality Protection Act might be taken to this next stage. If we really wanted to protect society during the periods of most rapid growth and development, we would be focusing in on exposures during pregnancy. So that, you know, as we go through our daily lives, I'll tell you, I'll close with just this thought. As we go through our daily lives, and we're struggling trying to figure out what's worth really paying attention to and worrying about, I'll tell you what I worry about. I worry predominantly about these intense exposures that would come from more contaminated environments that could include the workplace, could also include homes that are sprayed by chemicals, or airtight buildings. Buildings are becoming more airtight, including this one, meaning that any chemicals that are brought into it are problematic. I also worry about mixtures of chemicals that have the same target effect, say on the central nervous system. What might those be? Pesticides, solvents, air pollutants, so that we're exposed to chemicals that might influence organ systems as mixtures, but we don't regulate them as mixtures. We regulate them one by one. So I'll be available for questions later on during the morning, but I think I'll just end there and tell you that the major innovations in the past 20 years have included the Food Quality Protection Act that has set the tough legal standard, and what we'll hear about more this afternoon will be the National Organic Standard and the work that Jay and the Organic Board have been focusing on. So that the rise of certifying that food safety on the one hand, at the same time using a hammer to reduce our exposure and reduce the licenses that are out there for these recognized toxic substances. These strategies are I think, making the food supply safer than it's ever been. But as I said earlier, you know, we have a number of different threats that we need to pay more attention to. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.